All right, welcome back to my channel. I've got an interesting one today, one that would make a great episode of Unsolved Mysteries. This is Imperial Legend, The Disappearance of Alexander I by Alexis S. Troubetzkoy. So maybe I'll tell you a little bit about the author from the back of the book. So Alexis S. Troubetzkoy was born in Paris in 1934 into a princely Russian family. At an early age, he emigrated to the United States and later to Canada. A teacher of history for 34 years, he has been the headmaster of Selwyn House School in Quebec and Appleby College and Toronto French School in Ontario. The author of The Road to Baklava, Stumbling into War with Russia, Alexis Troubetzkoy has been involved with international humanitarian work in Russia and the former Yugoslavia since his retirement from teaching in 1993. He lives in Toronto. Well, he did. Okay, he's since deceased, but he has connections to some pretty influential people within Imperial Russia. Okay, some of his ancestors are mentioned in here. In fact, one of his relatives was a member of the Decembrist plot in 1825, the first attempt at a revolution, um, which happened in the kind of the absence of a czar, because when Alexander died, or if he didn't die, the throne was empty for a period of time while they were trying to figure out who his successor was going to be. Okay, because the crown eventually passed to Nicholas I, his younger brother, and not to Constantine, who everybody thought it was going to be, which would have been next in line since Alexander had no children. All right, but we'll talk about this. We'll read the inside flap of the book here. For a quarter century, Tsar Alexander I ruled over an empire of 44 million subjects in a country that covered 1/7 of the globe. As the vanquisher of Napoleon, he became the most powerful man in Europe, a sovereign of untold wealth and power. In 1825, at the age of 48, Alexander, a sturdy man in excellent health, died under mysterious circumstances. At his funeral, few people actually saw the body, which remained covered all the way to its final resting place in the Romanov family crypt in St. Petersburg. Rumors immediately began to circulate that the body was not Alexander's, but that of a stranger. It was whispered that the Tsar had faked his own death in order to escape into anonymity, shedding the burdens of the throne he had reluctantly assumed after the murder of his father. Years later, stories were told of a certain Starets, one of the many ascetic wanderers or penitents, who moved about Siberia living on charity and offering prayers for those in need. According to the legend, this princely starlet, who died in 1864 and was known for his unique spiritual qualities, was Alexander. Part history, part detective story, Imperial Legend attempts to unravel the mystery surrounding the death of Tsar Alexander I and offers up a mesmerizing portrait of what really happened to the leader of one of the world's most powerful nations. Now, on face value, this sounds preposterous. You go, really? Really? Did he really fake his death? Like, come on, man. This sounds insane. But what initially kind of shocked me when I was reading kind of the first chapter of this book was the testimony of Olga here. Now, the author himself, he knew her and met her on several occasions. And that kind of gives a little bit of, I don't know, a little bit of credibility to this. So I'll read this from page 11. As a young naval officer in 1958, I was briefly stationed in Hamilton, Ontario, not far from where Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna lived. She was the sister of Nicholas II. So, yeah, the last Tsar, right? Nicholas II. This was his sister living in exile. So, this guy right here. All right. She was the daughter of Alexander III. Now, Alexander III was, of course, a czar himself. All right. And in early 1920, she and her commoner husband, Colonel Nikolai Kulovkovsky, with their 2 infant sons, managed to escape. Their journey took them out through the Black Sea to Belgrade and to Denmark, whence they emigrated to Canada. The couple bought a farm in rural Ontario, and there, with their 2 sons, lived a life of exile. After the colonel's death, the Grand Duchess moved to Toronto, where she died in 1960. I visited Her Imperial Highness on a number of occasions. She and I got along famously. With the brashness of youth, I asked her scores of questions about Russian history and her own past. With candor and charm, she replied patiently to all my inquiries. During our 3rd or 4th meeting, I broached the subject of Feodor Kuzmich, this holy man, right? Maybe there's a picture of this guy here. So he's going to ask her about this fellow. Okay, this known portrait of the starets right here, this holy man. Here is the residence in which he lived. This is his cell in Tomsk, Siberia. All right, and then of course on the cover, here's Alexander the First, disappeared or died at the age of 48. Is there a resemblance? I don't know. You tell me. Is this guy, does he look like Alexander? Do they look the same? These are both photos, but I don't know. There is kind of a resemblance. Anyways, this Feodor Kuzmich, who has been canonized as a saint in 1984, he was officially recognized as a saint by the Russian Orthodox Church. Okay, so our author here asked Grand Duchess Olga about Kuzmich, and she says here that, let's see, I visited Her Imperial Highness on a number of occasions. She and I got along famously. With brashness of use, I asked her scores of questions about Russian history, her own past. With candor and charm, she replied patiently to all my inquiries. During our 3rd or 4th meeting, I broached the subject of Feodor Kuzmich. Here she visibly blanched and then declared rather curtly, in our family, Feodor Kuzmich was not a subject for discussion. I was much taken aback by this frigid and uncharacteristic reaction. A pregnant silence followed, but then she took my hand into hers and with a touch and smile said, we really didn't discuss it, but I am old and not long for this world. You are young and apparently have understanding of these things. You should know that we have no doubt that Feodor Kuzmich was the emperor. So when she says we, she's meaning her father, Alexander III, and of course, Nicholas II. There were 3 inquiries into this. A lot of the documentation of Alexander's reign was destroyed by his brother, who assumed the crown, Nicholas I. There was definitely some sort of a cover-up or an elimination of material. This unknown yacht we don't know anything about that was imported at Taganrog, where Alexander I was. It was flying a Union Jack. It is surmised that perhaps this boat belonged to the Earl of Cathcart, the British emissary to the Tsar and a personal friend of Tsar Nicholas. But we don't know. We can't find any real documentation about it. It is surmised that he took this ship, if he did indeed flee, and went to Palestine from 1825 to when he reappeared as Feodor Kuzmich in 1836, if the legend is indeed true. But why would Alexander III and Nicholas II remain hush-hush about this legend if it was true? Well, we have to understand that the whole idea of the imperial coronation, the holy chrism or the holy oil that is put upon the Tsar by the church, which kind of gives him his ordination to the office. Here on page 244. As we have seen, Nicholas I ordered much of the written documentation related to his brother's life and death, including family correspondence and diaries be destroyed. Alexander II, Alexander III, and Nicholas II all interested themselves in the legend, but not one of them openly declared himself on the subject. On the contrary, this seems to have been a shared anxiety to keep the matter quiet, even if the cover-up efforts were often clumsy. A leading culprit in this was the arch-conservative, I'm going to butcher this Russian name, Pobedonostsev something. Sorry. If Feodor Kuzmich was Alexander I, why the anxiety to conceal the fact? After all, the events in Taganrog occurred nearly 3/4 of a century before Nicholas II. The reason may be that the Starets survived until 1864. If he was indeed the emperor then, Siberian wanderer or not, he legally continued as the legitimate, unabdicated sovereign. The chrism, the holy oil, all right, placed upon him, of the coronation anointment given by God is not easily thrust aside. Quote, there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Unquote. That's from Romans 13:1, right? Quoted by St. Paul. The Starets lived throughout the reign of Nicholas I in 9 years into the reign of Alexander II. Hence, legal argument could be made that the reigns of the first sovereign and a good portion of the second were illegitimate. All the laws enacted from 1825 to 1864, therefore, might be null and void. A wildly unthinkable situation. So there you can see why they would want to cover this up. Now, one of the people that says that the legend is entirely probable and I think believed in it was Leo Tolstoy. And he writes about, I think, a fictional story, if I'm not mistaken. And I'll see if I can find it here because I did find his 5 points of contention or his 5 points that he put forth as interesting. So here we go. Tolstoy took an interest in the legend. 2 years after his death in 1910, a manuscript by the author was published, the posthumous notes of the Starets Feodor Kuzmich. This work takes the curious form of a fictional diary written by Kuzmich himself. Despite the lack of the full body of circumstantial evidence favoring the legend that we have today, Tolstoy believed in it and spoke of it as credible. The author makes the interesting and salient point that Alexander's transformation into a Siberian starets was very much in keeping with the emperor's character. Tolstoy then lists 5 reasons for believing that the Tsar did not die as recorded by history. Number 1, Alexander's death in Taganrog came on too suddenly, and prior to that, he had been in excellent health, never suffering any illness. Number 2, the death occurred in one of Russia's most remote outposts, thus making it easier to effect a disappearance. Number 3, the features of the corpse in the imperial casket were so distorted as to make them virtually unrecognizable. Number 4, on frequent occasions, especially towards the latter part of his life, Alexander declared his desire to shed his duties and retire quietly out of public eye. And number 5, the autopsy report noted that the body's back was bruised as though from a lashing, an impossibility for an imperial person. So was this the body of a serf that had been beaten? Similar size and build? Who was the person in the casket? One of the things that this book is trying to advocate for is DNA testing. Let's find out whose body is in the crypt and do DNA testing to find out if it is a Romanov or not. But the fact that the Grand Duchess Olga, okay, the exiled sister of Tsar Nicholas II, believed in the legend and thought that it was true, for me, does make it probable. Right? And there she is right there, Grand Duchess Olga, prior to her death in 1860. I mean, that's pretty heavy for me. Now, Is the legend true? I don't know. There is no definitive exclamation point or not, but the case remains an unsolved mystery. So we need to get Robert Stack on the case here. I think he's dead. Well, whatever. All right, that's it. I got nothing else to say. This was an interesting read for me. Now, I will say one final thing in closing. The bulk of this book, the first 13 chapters, are kind of a biography on Alexander the First, kind of his rise to power, his signing on as a co-conspirator to removing his father Paul from the throne. And Paul was murdered, all right? Alexander had guilt over it, apparently, up until his last day, believing that his father was going to be exiled, and instead his father was killed. Now, I don't know if he was just naive or if the whole thing he didn't know was a lie and he later regretted it or what, but there you go. There's a reason for him being weary of the throne. So the first 13 chapters chronicle kind of a biography of his rise to power, his life, his reign, and his death. And then chapters 14 through the conclusion of the book are about Feodor Kuzmich, and kind of the case put forward is this or is this not the same person? Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.